So, talking again about Barry Magid's application of the idea of dissociation, the psychological process, to our Zen practice. And over the years, one of the major new influences on his thinking about this has been the work of the psychoanalyst Philip Bromberg and his idea and development of the concept of self-states. Just in the words itself, it's actually quite a nice concept. It uses self in approximately the same everyday sense that Barry does. Here we're not drawing a distinction between some transcendental, permanent idea of the self that we're always talking about in Buddhism in terms of not self. We're just talking about this everyday idea is one thing, but more than idea. And I guess the way even we can tend to talk about self-states is perhaps a little confusing. There are several ways in which we can point to this, obviously. We can do so in some quite traditional Buddhist ways. Am I the same self? Am I the same person that I was when I was a baby or I was 5? And obviously the answer is, well, in most respects, not. I don't think the same. I don't have the same feelings. I don't have the same body. I don't experience my body in the same way. I don't like the same things. I don't know the same things. And yet, of course, there is this sense of continuity, the sense, well, of course, at one level, of course I'm that person. Equally, Buddhism talks about a moment-by-moment reinvention of the self. To use self as a verb here, that I self again in each moment, afresh, reconfigure an idea, a practice, a way of being me. And while both of those are useful, I think Bromberg's idea of self-states gives us something new. Now, one of the most important things to remember is that it's relational. All self-states, in this sense, are relational. They're about the way in which I come to be a me in relation to the world. And again, we can talk about, in a slightly misleading way, the way that as a father, I'm not quite the same person that I am as a sculptor or as a Zen teacher or as a husband or any other of these roles. But again, there's kind of an invitation in thinking that way to limit it to the notion of identity or a role. An identity sounds a bit tick box or, set of beliefs or something like that. Way I see myself. Role, that's good, that's relational. But again, it's something I can pick up and put down and not to do with me as such. So I think this idea of self-state is really important because yes, in a way it's all of these, but it's something more than that. It's a way of being in the world, in that context and in that moment. The way that I speak, the gestures that I use, the actual way that I sit, the set of memories that come into my mind, the fantasies or aspirations that I have about the future. The self-state is all of these. It's much more than an identity or a role. And even in the way that I've been talking about it, I think there's a potential to mislead there. So it's something bigger than that. Barry talks in Nothing is Hidden about the relationships between these self-states, like when I was younger and I used to go and visit my parents, and yes, exactly, one falls into that kind of son self-state fairly instantly. One's treated by one's parents as their son, and the conversation, the gestures, the postures, the family position, it's all there, and it's all, whoa, just like it was yesterday, and not. And I'm aware of that tension, that pull between the two, potential dissociation between those two kind of states. But my mum died 4 years ago now. But that wasn't the end of our relationship. And that wasn't the end of the self-states that I'd associate with that relationship. I grieve. I work through. I remember. Sometimes with pleasure, sometimes not. That relationship self-state is still very much there. And a self-state need not be tied to the experience of a particular person or a particular set of people. It's more complicated than that. So relational is important. But this whole way of being in the world is important. Barry gives us a few really useful quotes here. So let's see if I can find the first one that I want. Yeah, okay. So this is Claire Tomlin, Charles Dickens biographer, writing about an apparently fictional meeting between Dickens and the Russian novelist Dostoevsky. All the good simple people in his novels, Dickens said, Little Nell, even the holy simpletons, like Barnaby Rudge, are what he wanted to have been, and his villains were what he was, or rather what he found in himself. His cruelty, his attacks of causeless enmity towards those who were helpless and looked to him for comfort, his shrinking from those he ought to love. There were two people in him, he told me, one who feels as he ought to feel, and one who feels the opposite. From the one who feels the opposite, I make my evil characters. From the one who feels as a man ought to, I try to live my life. Only two people, asked Dostoevsky. And Barry comments, in this fable, Dickens is able to accept the fact that he contains opposites. Dostoevsky can go further and, like Walt Whitman, say, I contain multitudes. What really interests me in that quote is the story element of it, but not as a narrative of events, not as words, but to the extent that Dickens' writing is great writing, it's because he completely realises those characters. We can see them. We can hear their voices when we're reading. We can anticipate in advance what they're going to think about something, what they're going to do. We can feel the emotions as the world changes around them. We don't even necessarily need to be told that. Out of this basic good and evil polarisation, Dickens actually conjures a multitude of self-states. And I think that's the interesting thing there. Just as much as Walt Whitman or Dostoevsky might experience themselves as multitudes, here Dickens is conjuring multitudes, completely realised different beings. Presented to us again and again and again through the novels. It's interesting also that this is showing how potentially independent those are. What's the connection between these self-states? Well, normally I feel quite a strong, quite an intimate connection between them. Let's read that Bromberg quote: "Self-states are what the mind comprises." Okay, so mind is basically made out of self-states. I'm in this state, I move to that state. Dissociation is what the mind does. And I think you can look at that both in the sense of internally, with regard to each self-state. It's a way too of buying into the world. I invest in this, I feel empathy with this, I feel emotion towards this, but not that. I'll come back to that a little bit later, it's really important. But there are also obviously dissociation between self-states. I show up as one self-state, the world changes, I'm in a different context. I show up as a different self-state. What's the relationship between the two? Well, that's quite subtle. Okay, this is important. We are constantly looking, however much we know, however long we've practiced, however thorough our psychology and understanding, we're always looking for what stands behind, like in Zazen. I'm sitting, but I can see myself as the observer of my sitting back, holding it all together, aware of this and aware of that, but at the same time, separate from it. Likewise, and this is really the distinction between thinking of self-states as identities or roles, Bromberg is not suggesting that there's somebody there that ties all this together. There's some consciousness, there's some self which is tying all of this together and opting into this self-state and now opting into that state. No, the self-states are it. In terms of Barry's title of the Cohen book in which he's discussing this, nothing is hidden. There is nothing behind these self-states. These self-states are it. Which poses a real question then. Okay, so if there's no me, no continuous I behind the self-states holding it all together, what is actually going on? Right. Self-states are what the mind comprises. Yep. Dissociation is what the mind does. I said, looked at that from two different directions. The relationship between self-states and dissociation is what the mind is. Now that's really interesting because there's no simple, no easy way to nail that down, is there? We have self-states which in a sense are autonomous, but equally depend upon each other. I'm still the same person, more or less, through all of these self-states. What is tying them together? Well, it's the precise way in which I dissociate within and between all these different self-states. And Bromberg says it's the stability of that relationship that enables a person to experience continuity as I. A flexible relationship amongst self-states through the use of ordinary dissociation, buying into and buying out of, and then buying out of that state and buying into the other self-state, which works in a different way, buying into this, not buying into that. A flexible relationship amongst self-states through the use of ordinary dissociation is what allows a human being to engage the ever-shifting requirements of life's complexities with creativity and spontaneity. So we've got some interesting words there. We've got flexibility. I think we could also talk of terms of tolerance and transparency. Let's just nip back to the idea of this I standing behind, this continuous I, which is observing what's going on. The aim there is really to pull everything together, to integrate all these separate self-states to make a single coherent self. The I that I'd like to think of myself as. The I that has will and intention, purpose. That's not quite possible if we've got this constant negotiation of one self-state with another self-state with another self-state. Flexibility, yes. If I can negotiate between these self states without too much tension, allow the tension to be there, like when I used to go around and see my mum, but not get spooked by it, not panic, feel, oh, I have to be this way, and disappear down that, sun rabbit hole. But actually, no, I can be this and I can be that, and I can feel the tension between the two, but I'm flexible. I can move moment by moment, if necessary, between the two. And so I can become more tolerant of that. This is back to Joko's a bigger container. I can just hold these different self-states whole without feeling they'll have to conform to the same set of standards and values all the time, which is me represented in the world. So this notion of self-states obviously ties up really well with the Buddhist idea of not self in this sense. Here we have not a kind of generalized description, but a real useful idea that we can observe ourselves doing moment by moment by moment in the world. And Bromberg talks about the possibility of having a creative response to this. If I'm buying in and buying out, okay, I can get that. But within each, how does that actually happen? Well, this is where he comes up with this lovely notion of standing in the spaces. That I'm literally, the more I become aware of the transitions, the more I become aware of the particular investments, associations, dissociations involved in each self-state, the more I can come to stand in the spaces, as he says. Standing in the spaces. As in, between these self-states, there is the infinite flux of possible me. Not some transcendental permanent I, but a kind of field of possibility. And by standing in the spaces between these very specific, very particular self-states that I can observe in myself, that I can observe as myself, I can come to have the possibility for creative response to situations rather than stereotyped and habitual reactions. It's a lovely way of describing what's happening in our practice when it's kind of working for us. States communicate. Change can happen standing in the spaces. Another quote. This is from Graham Greene's Brighton Rock. There's another man within me, and he's angry with me. Barry says, the other man within, simultaneously someone who's both myself and not me, someone who's judging me by a set of standards that are not quite my own, not quite available to my own scrutiny, but which I also cannot escape. Note how different Greene's declaration is from the simple statement, I am angry with myself. Being angry with oneself reflects a more ordinary sense of conflict, of, say, not having done what one knows would have been the right thing to do. But to have another man within reflects the more mysterious phenomenon of dissociation, of having one part of oneself being other to another part. Dissociation, being cut off emotionally from aspects of ourselves that feel like not me, whether our vulnerability, our sexuality, our aggression, our need for love, our sense of inner damage or inner wholeness, are the dualisms of everyday life that create the suffering that practice is meant to relieve. Okay, so that's a really important notion as well. I'll take this sideways. Let's go right back. And I mean, half the Dharma talks I've ever done I stuck with. turning towards, turning away. And we're exactly in the same place again. Why is Greens in a man angry? What's he actually angry with about? Why do we turn away from each other? Why do we turn away from ourselves? What am I turning away from? Anyway, what actually? A feeling, always a feeling of discomfort that manifests physically, that's associated with the experience of emotion, or most definitely thought trains as well. But this feeling of being partially aware of and partially cut off from, that's absolutely dissociation to a T. It kind of goes a bit dark, goes a bit fuzzy. I'm not really sure what's happening over there. It's kind of me, but it kind of bleeds out into the not me. What's actually going on there? Well, some kind of aspect of myself, another self state that I'm not wanting to buy into, that parts of me can't tolerate, can't own. It's still relational because, even this turning away, even this rejection is still to do with our social world. It's things like, well, what would they think of me? Well, that could be my parents, my friends, my children, the others. In psychoanalysis, some of these are functions. We talk about the superego, but, we don't necessarily have to look at it in that respect. It's, where does this otherness come from? What's this other voice within me? Of course, where it becomes properly pathological is where there's no transparency. And again, we're talking about the flexibility of negotiating between self-states. Well, that also requires a certain transparency of self-states. I know what it's like to go and visit my mum. I know what it's like to be in the workshop or talking to a client. I know what it's like to be talking to my daughters, whether that's now or whether that's for small. There's a fair degree of transparency between these. Where it becomes pathological is, or one way in which it becomes pathological, is where these become mainly or even completely sealed, and the phenomena of alters, where I can literally show up as one person and then show up a day later or a moment later as a completely separate person. But that's only the extreme end of what we're all doing all the time in that sense. That's when there's zero transparency. But again, that Green quote really nails it on this sense of, well, I sort of know this other guy, but I sort of don't as well. It's a really nice, sharp way of beginning to get into that. And this is where it potentially gets quite difficult. But let's go for it anyway. What if that self-state in which I absolutely don't want to buy into is one which is a real problem? I've worked with prisoners from time to time, quite a few actually over the years, who are there for sexual offences involving children. Now certainly they're a self-selecting cohort that I ever get to see. But these are not, the kind of evil scheming monsters cackling and contemplating the next crime. They're people who are destroyed by feeling this separation, this otherness between them, between the part that is you would meet on the street, you would have a perfectly good conversation with, and the part that is pulled, compelled, often very much against the will of this, we can even say majority part, towards what that part knows to be completely wrong, completely unacceptable. And yet, we can take a couple more mundane examples. Let's say the Zen teacher, who is full of goodness and kindness and equanimity, and leaves the Zendo. and opens the bottle of scotch and downs it before inviting their new and wonderfully attractive young female student to have a personal interview. Or another absolute stereotype, the concentration camp guard who has been doing whatever unspeakable, alienated task, completely devoid of empathy for the real-life human beings with which he's dealing. Or the torturer in Chile, or, whoever. And then goes home, has their dinner, plays with the children, pats the dog. These are real, handbrake turns between self-states, but they're possible. And within this fairly strong dissociation lies the possibility for real harming of others, harming of ourselves for that matter. It's complicated. So Bromberg's absolutely 100% right to see the real deal actually is how we negotiate between these self-states. Is there sufficient flexibility? Is there sufficient transparency? Can we cope? Can we be big enough containers to hold these tensions? Even the parts of us that we don't like, even the parts of us that could potentially cause harm, without acting out that harm, without being that harming. So I think this notion of holding self-states here is hugely useful. All of these involve picking and choosing. Many of them are kind of fundamental in relationship to our parents, but we have to remember that our parents are always fully members of society already. So, choices that I never experience, or rarely experience as choices which usually appear to be made for me, either by those outside of me or by something deep within me, like the choices between being male or female, heterosexual, homosexual, cis, trans. All of these are roles we are raised into, and sometimes we can cope with the inevitable tensions between these. Who would be some kind of cartoon character for all of these? We know the stereotypes. Are you a real man or a mummy's boy? It's endless. And probably none of us experience no tension. But often we can find perfectly good ways of dealing with that tension through understanding these relationships that don't relate to these very absolute dualities, binaries. But any difficulty we do experience may well result in shame. Whether that's shame we heap on ourselves or shame that is heaped on us from outside. And they're far closer than we might think, because in a sense one is impossible without the other. So can I cope with these complexities that I feel? Do I dissociate from this complexity? Do I just shut down, find a self-state which is quieter but more restricted? Can I contain this dissociation? Does it become repressed and generalised as anxiety, depression, acting out? I want to be right. I want to be good. I want to be valued. I want to be recognised. I want to be loved. I want to be seen to have value. And shaming deprives me absolutely in the face of all of these. I am not valued in this moment from this point of view. And this is fundamentally linked to dissociation. It's far from the only mechanism of shame, but I'll just finish with Bromberg's little quote that Barry gives. A failure of responsiveness by the mother or father to some genuine aspect of the child's self. Not necessarily open disapproval or abusiveness. And as I say, that can be about any of these difficult questions or 100 other things. But a masked withdrawal from authentic contact that leaves the child experiencing part of herself as having no pleasurable value to a loved one. Not loved, not recognised, not valuable. And thus, no relational experience as part of me. The child's own need for loving recognition becomes despised and shame-ridden. The need becomes a dissociated not me aspect of self that, when triggered, releases not only unmet hunger for authentic responsiveness, but a flood of shame. So dissociation, in some ways a hinge between our personal experience and our social world. An absolutely necessary part of human being, as we are one self-state after another, as we are aware of the different self-state space that we occupy, but also allowing for that possibility of harming ourselves, of harming each other, opening the door to this catastrophic shaming that can destroy lives, force us to do things that we otherwise never would. And we'll come back to this and we'll explore it as we carry on thinking through how we act as individuals, how we act together, collectively. So Bromberg's work, I think, is really valuable and important, and thanks to Barry for placing it before us in this context.